Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 6th Annual San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing Conference. We're letting folks into the room here, and so I'm going to say a few words as we begin to admit all of our guests. But thank you very much for being here today. We're really pleased to see such a great turnout. My name is Stephen Russell. I'm the president and CEO of the San Diego Housing Federation. This is, as I said, our 6th annual. I think we may have advertised as our 7th, but we were doing the math before we started the show here today. And it is our 6th. We've had some great programs over the years. Many of you I saw from the guest list that many of you have been with us each of these years. So you'll remember, I think our first year was Dr. Antwi Ecom from the University of San Francisco. He was our keynote speaker. We had Richard Rothstein, who was talking about the color of law. And we also had Dr. Manuel Pastor to talk about a lot of the economic impacts, the drivers and impacts of inequity in society. Really great speakers. We have a great history here. And really we are honored as the San Diego Housing Federation to be partners with the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing in presenting today's conference. I do want to give, in addition to welcoming all of you here, I do want to thank our sponsors for today's event, the San Diego Housing Commission, the California Housing Finance Agency, and Citibank, all of whom generously contributed to making this possible. Of course, I will thank many times over the entire group of folks at the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. It is really an honor to be able to work with you every year producing this program. And I will be introducing the president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing momentarily here. I also, before we go into that, I just want to give a big shout out to the staff here at the Federation for the work that they've done. I know Estella will give you, will thank her people, but I just want to thank our staff for pulling this together. Brooklyn, who is behind the scenes, making sure that all of you made it here safely via Zoom. But a really big shout out to Laura Nunn, who led the production of this program. And we wouldn't be here today at all without all of her really hard work. So you'll get a chance to hear more from her, especially tomorrow. But we really, I just want to give our heartfelt thanks. With that, as I say, we're really pleased to be the co-producer of this event with the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. And so with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage the Executive Director of CSA San Diego County, Estela de los Rios, who is not just with CSA, but she's also a great community leader and president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing. Estela, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. As president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, I thank all of you for joining us today as we unravel, explore, and share our thoughts on fair housing and segregation. April is a celebration of Fair Housing Month, and we are expanding on the 1968 Act, which prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and as amended, handicap and familial status. On April 11th, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1968, known as the Fair Housing Act. Today, we are unraveling some of that segregation that exists in our communities. How does segregation affect housing? The effects of housing segregation include relocation, unequal living standards, and poverty. However, there have been initiatives to combat housing segregation, such as Section 8 housing programs. Racial residential segregation doubled from 1880 to 1940. Southern urban areas were the most segregated. Today, neighborhood segregation is more evident now due to 3 factors: health, education, and housing needs. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the subcommittee from the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing and the Housing Federation for all their contributions in making this conference a success. So again, welcome and enjoy day 1. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Estela. And I wish we were in a big room where we can cheer you on, but you know that our hearts are there, and we're excited to be here. So thank you for those kind words. So this program this morning, we're going to have 3 guests. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them and then invite our keynote speaker to the stage. So our keynote today is Gustavo Velasquez, who is Director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development. In this leadership role, Velasquez leads California's housing policy agenda and administers a wide range of programs that produce, preserve, and protect affordable housing and communities of opportunity across the state. Velasquez served for nearly 3 years as Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Obama. And during his tenure, HUD achieved groundbreaking enforcement victories in fair lending and in major housing discrimination cases. And Velasquez led efforts to promulgate the landmark Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule, a key tool for cities, states, and other HUD funding recipients to reduce inequality and disparities in access to opportunity. After Director Velasquez speaks, we're going to hear from Tyrone Buckley, who is the Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at California HCD. He is a Juris Doctorate and a Master of City Planning from St. Louis, Cal Poly SLO. He's also, as I know him originally, is a former policy director at Housing California, so you may recognize him from there. Our third guest will be Ricardo Flores, who is Executive Director of Lisk San Diego, who previously spent 12 years as a senior aide to elected officials in Congress and City Hall here in San Diego. He's a City Heights native. He's both a friend and colleague, and I'll be pleased to welcome him to the stage after our first two speakers. So with that, I would like to welcome to the stage Director Velasquez. Gustavo, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, San Diego and San Diego region. I am very pleased to be here with you all today. Happy Fair Housing Month. We are coming to the end of another important celebration, 54th anniversary of the enactment of the Fair Housing Act. And as you may well guess, this aspect of housing policy is near and dear to my heart, having worked at the national level on these issues in the Obama administration. And every time I have the opportunity to talk about fair housing and how we can continue to work across government with advocacy always to further fair housing in our communities, is just a pleasure to be able to share my thoughts with you all. As you may know, it is the law of the land here in California, fair housing, fair and equitable housing, making it a front and center priority at every level of government and within communities across the Golden State. Before I came to California, I had the opportunity to work at the Urban Institute, where there's notorious the research coming out of this national research organization on how is the country moving forward with creating the conditions, whether it's through the important policy levers, zoning, land use, to just open up communities to housing choice. That's really the bottom line when it comes to fair housing. It's the individual choice that people have to live whatever they want. And we have a sad history in our country for decades, arguably generations, to create barriers to people because of the color of their skin or their accent, or whether they have families or whether they're disabled, just barriers to prevent people from accessing that, for being able to make that choice on their own. And so I'm sure we'll spend some time today just reminding ourselves. This is just a continuing reminder of this history of barriers and activity that has kept, often government sponsored, I should say, that has kept communities out of access to housing, and increasing levels of segregation based on your inherent characteristics you're born with. And these barriers have the segregation has just really compounded the levels of poverty. This is all very much interconnected. Your race, your ethnicity, your characteristic as a person with disability, or your gender orientation, or whatever these own individual characteristics are, the barriers have really compounded not only access to housing, but because of the relationship with income, it has just exacerbated levels of poverty and inequality, as at a time where inequality in our country is greater and greater, the have-nots, and this has the very much a potential risk for the United States not being the undisputed land of opportunity that we all know it is. And so California always has led the way as a place of innovation and a place where, you know, for generations, people from all over the world come to pursue the California dream. However, we all define that dream. There is a California dream that has to be reanimated, and it has to be reanimated by creating a California for all, where everybody has sees a level playing field in pursuing their dreams. And housing is very much a lever that can limit or increase access to that opportunity in chase of the California dream. And when we see policies and practices that prevent the access of housing, which is tied to opportunity for many people, we're gonna have troubles in creating that California dream for everyone. So I just want to say, going back to, you know, Steve mentioned the work in 2015 under the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing policy that President Obama put into place. Obviously, it was a huge disappointment when, after his administration, these efforts to advance fair housing were crushed by the following administration. Fortunately, we are back in business when it comes to promoting and enforcing fair housing with President Biden, Secretary Marcia Fudge at HUD, everybody kind of understanding that there's a lot of restoring that needs to take place at the federal level to put back in place important tools that advance fair housing across communities. The important aspect as Californians that we need to understand is that here in California, after the Obama administration took efforts to provide tools to local communities to dismantle segregation, immediately California, as an innovator, took the steps to codify into law our own California strong affirmatively furthering fair housing provisions. And even during the Trump administration, we continued to march forward with the strong legal requirements here in the state that would prevent jurisdictions from, you know, turning around, looking the other way, and not paying attention to efforts to desegregate their communities. And by that, what I mean is communities taking a balanced approach to we have areas that have been neglected, disinvested. Of course, these communities have now been subject to new investments in the last few years, more economic activity. And so there's a new effect of areas that been traditionally low income, you know, with limited investments. Now they're turning the tide. The growth is accelerating, economic activity is picking up, and now we have the issue of gentrification and potential displacement of residents that have lived for many years. So we've been, when we say affirmatively further fair housing, we mean investments in those communities to ensure that people in those communities remain in place, remain in their communities. whenever there are communities that are continue to be low income, disinvestments, we have to invest more resources, more housing, more affordable housing there to spur economic development of other types. And of course, we also have the communities that have always been high opportunity with increasing job creation and a lot of economic activity, a lot of investments, usually affluent communities where we also want to create more affordable housing to give, again, going back to my earlier comment, just allow choice. You have to be able to have the choice to live in whatever community you want. So opportunity to create more housing in those high opportunity neighborhoods in order to give people choice to live there. So when it comes to affirmatively furthering fair housing, really what we're saying is expand the availability of opportunity across community through the creation of housing everywhere that gives people more choice. If you want to live in the community you lived before, you have that choice. If you want to move to another area because of higher proficiency in the schools, lower crime, you should be able to do that. So it's just a balanced approach of creating opportunity across all of our communities, any community, every single one of our communities across the state. That's really what furthering fair housing is all about, creating greater and greater choice. But I should say, going back, it was really something that the legislature that anticipated the rollback of federal requirements, codified again in 2018 through the passage of AB 686, this really important law in the state of California that created the framework for our state to further fair housing, promote inclusive communities, further housing choice, and address the racial and economic disparities through government operations, programs, and policies. Now, along with AB 686, another important law, AB 1771, probably the single most important tool we have to address systemic racism in housing and achieve positive impacts for all Californians. That combined with the fact that there's never been a greater time in our history than right now to advance fair housing, all of these tools that we created in the state of California to help communities of them. But it starts with the state, right? That's something very important. Sometimes we go to communities from the perspective of the state, and always it sounds like it's just telling communities what they need to. It starts with us. Let me just say that it starts with the state creating, making changes to our own programs, making changes to the way that we conduct business at the state. And that's very important. For example, right now, the California Department of Housing is reviewing hundreds and hundreds of local housing plans because we are entering a new cycle of housing planning for the creation between now and 2030 of 2.5 million additional new homes. That's the goal that we have. It's not just a goal, it's a mandate, because this all ties to required new housing creation mandates that each jurisdiction has to meet for the next 8 years. That's the number, 2.5 million homes. And as a result of that goal and mandate, right now we're reviewing all of these housing plans for each jurisdiction. And it's, in fact, San Diego was actually first, the San Diego region was the first to start working on these housing plans. Great majority of those plans now have been reviewed and either approved or disapproved in the San Diego region. This aspect of fair housing, as we go through the review of those plans, is very important. The aspect of, okay, if you have to create all of this new housing in your community, it's got to be a way for you to do it. You have to explain to the state how, and not just to the state, to your community is more important. There's a strong community engagement and participation aspect here. The community has to weigh in heavily in how these plans are being prepared by cities. And of course, there is, because the numbers are much greater than in previous years, you have to think of, hundreds, maybe thousands of additional parcels where you're going to create new housing, especially affordable housing. You have to have proof additional capacity to create this new housing, ensure that the sites are realistic, right? That these areas where you're going to create the new housing are areas where you can actually be able to break ground on new construction of new housing. So we pay attention to these things, but it's not just about volume of units of housing. It's about how you go about planning to create all this new housing. And it is important to have, when you get to the how, very much a fair housing lens. And that's what all of these additional state legislative legal requirements, all of this authority that's been granted to the State Department to review this plan, so important to have that lens. And we have the opportunity now to ensure that across the entire jurisdictions, housing is going to be there. It's not just further concentrating affordable housing in just one part of the community. That's, again, what historically has happened. That's why we have the levels of segregation we have by race and ethnicity and disability. That's why all this has compounded high levels of not only racial and ethnic concentration, but poverty concentration. And we've been able to now say back to jurisdictions, we need to just unlock opportunities really across all of these communities, not just in the traditional places where this has occurred. And so that's only one aspect, just one example of the lens that we're using in order to approve these housing plans. And we're seeing, some successes. We work, back and forth with jurisdictions multiple times until we see that they are applying that lens as well. And that's the goal. It's 2.5 million new homes between now and 2030, contemplating more housing in areas of high opportunity, contemplating more housing in areas that has proximity to important amenities, starting with jobs, because it's important to have proximity to jobs, have proximity to the places people usually on a daily basis go to, in order to also reduce the effects of climate change. As we know, the less we use vehicles, the more we are going to help the environment. And so housing planning has to be very much a part of how we are also addressing climate change. And of course, housing that has to be many types of housing, different composition of housing for individuals, for families, single families, multifamily, the missing middle that a lot of people now are talking more and more about, just the variety of housing and where the housing is created. We're really taking a much more comprehensive approach to the way the housing planning is created. And when we conduct all that work at the State Department, when we provide local jurisdictions millions in planning grants so that they plan with fair housing objectives in mind, when we provide incentives so that people that are doing more with fair housing can access more state resources to subsidize the type of housing that has to be created. When we're doing all of that, and still after all of that work, jurisdictions refuse to comply with our fair housing objectives, then we also have new authorities in the last few years that have been granted to us, to the Attorney General, to work together to hold these jurisdictions accountable. And that's also part of what we're doing right now and what we're seeing right now, a much more deliberate, intentional, forceful approach to housing accountability and enforcement. But it starts with ensuring that there is plenty of awareness and education and understanding of what these requirements are, these fair housing requirements are, in the communities. And we there's a lot of room for improvement here. Love to maybe in the Q&A session just to hear reactions of how people in the San Diego region are seeing fair housing taking a more a dominant kind of the approaches of government to using these requirements to improve the fair housing conditions in the San Diego communities. I think it was really important to hear people comment on that, because at the state level, we can work on all of these things that I'm mentioning, but at the end of the day, is local communities that on the ground are seeing the effects of improvements in fair housing. And so we really care about that feedback. We're appreciative always of that feedback that we hear from advocacy groups and local communities. Another important thing that I just want to mention is the policy framework, right, to advance fair housing. And we know that a lot of capital also is needed to create more housing. We are in a tremendous crisis of housing affordability, mostly because of shortages, because there isn't enough of it. So when there isn't enough of something, whether it's housing on any other commodity, you're going to have increasing prices of something, because how can be housing not desirable? Everybody needs a place to call home. So of course it's a necessity. Housing is a necessity. Housing is a right, it's a human right. And so we know that when there is very little of it, prices are going to continue to escalate. And so capital is very important to scale the level of housing really across communities, especially coastal communities where we see increasing levels of homelessness because of the shortages. Primarily, there are other reasons to homelessness, but lack of housing is certainly number one reason why homelessness has become so acute in the state of California. But low-income people, working people that are just one paycheck away from losing their home, and then where are they going to go since these shortages are massive? So capital is very important. The private sector, of course, has to lead with a lot of help in the construction of new housing. But when it comes to addressing where the largest shortage is, which is on housing that is affordable for low and very low income people, that's going to require a lot of subsidy, a lot of state, federal resources in order to make that unit of housing work financially for the people that are creating the housing, the developers, local communities. And so I just want to say there's been tremendous level of investments from Governor Newsom to this issue of homelessness and housing, $22 billion last year to address homeless and affordable housing. We're seeing tremendous production right now, historic really production. Just to give you a sense, in the last 3-4 years, the level of a state subsidy has put online, not a lot, about 5,000-6,000 new units of housing, which is just very, very small number. But in the construction pipeline, we have between 15,000 and 20,000 units that are right now getting built, and a lot of money right now that is going to create more housing. Of course, it takes time. It takes about 2-3 years from the time where all the funding is packaged together to create housing to actually have that unit, that new home online. It takes a few years, but we're seeing momentum. We're seeing an increase. We project that in the next year or two, permitting, the level of permits that local governments approve for occupancy of new housing is going to pick up. So capital is going to be very important. But I have to emphasize, when it comes to fair housing, to compliance with fair housing, it's going to be the right policy framework, and it's going to be the right implementation, state localities working together, and it's going to eventually take accountability and enforcement if we don't go far enough in dismantling patterns of segregation in creating that choice, creating housing across all communities, not just where historically affordable housing has been created. It really is all about, creating just more opportunity to build housing everywhere we can. Now, I'm so pleased that we're also joined by Tyrone Buckley, our Assistant Director of Fair Housing. He has great expertise in especially in taking a deeper dive at what those requirements are, what we expect of communities to do. Under Tyrone's leadership and his entire team's work, we're miles ahead of where we've been in the past in providing the guidance, support to get this housing elements, these housing plans where they need to be. You'll be hearing more details about this ongoing work in a minute. We have a slew of guidance documents, technical assistance, and resources to help get these portions of the housing plans across the finish line. An incredible amount of work has been put into something on our website called the AFFH Data Viewer Tool, which assembles various data sources and provide options for addressing each of the components within the full scope of fair housing assessments. This tool is useful for local government planning, but it's also an asset to organizations, advocacy groups. We want to democratize that to make democratize data and have you involved, explore this data, hold your localities and us as well accountable when you see very little progress. And this data dashboard just help you on see the progress across time. So it's something very, very important for you to see on our website. In addition to data tools, we have the newly released statewide housing action plan that calls for, as I just said earlier, the creation of 2.5 million new homes in the next 8 years. It's very important, the level of information, the level of data that we provide to communities in order to see the progress in this arduous and collaborative approach to solving the crisis of homelessness and the crisis of housing affordability, very much so with that fair housing lens. So I just wanna say thank you for the invitation. We haven't done a whole lot in this month in celebration of Fair Housing Month, so this just gave me a great opportunity to share with you a few words about the efforts to affirmatively further fair housing, some of the things that we're doing at the state level. I'm sure Tyrone will expand on that, but thank you for everything you do in the San Diego region. I know, communities vary a lot. It's a big region, just the city of San Diego with the diversity and richness of neighborhoods. And so I just wanna end by saying to all of the advocacy groups, the community groups, thank you for your persistence, for your continuing feedback, for holding everybody up and down the chain, state localities accountable for doing more on fair housing. You keep us going. So the more you keep your advocacy, the more we will know where the gaps exist and the more we can work with your local government to push the envelope farther. So thank you for all the work that you do advocating for fair housing.
Great. Gustavo, thank you again. I wish we were in a room where we could share our enthusiasm with applause, but I know folks are out there just thrilled that you could join us for part of this. Is our celebration for Fair Housing Month. We're wonks. We spend our time, we're housing geeks, most of us. This is how we celebrate. So thank you for being a part of that key celebration and your kind words about this region. I don't want to take any more time with me. I want to get to Tyrone Buckley, who is again Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at California HCD. Tyrone, the stage is yours.
Great. I am working on sharing my screen. Did that work? Oh, well, let's see here. Did that work?
It's working.
Great. You can see my first slide there.
Yes, you got something in the way. Your script, your notes are showing.
Oh, sorry. One moment. How does that work now?
Not seeing your shared.
One sec.
There we are. Perfect.
All right.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Tyrone Buckley. I'm Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at HCD. I lead up our Fair Housing Unit. The Fair Housing Unit has been around for about the last 4 years, was created to work on implementation and make sure that HCD is addressing not only federal fair housing law, but also new state fair housing law that we heard talked about a little bit already today. The Fair Housing Unit addresses those issues, but also addresses issues of tribal inclusion. We implement new state law around making sure that tribes have access to our funding programs and that we have strong technical assistance for them. We also work on the TCAC HCD opportunity maps I know a lot of folks are familiar with. We work on accessibility issues and implement state law around affordable housing and issues that affect protected classes across the board. We've grown exponentially. I think all of you have seen the HCD hires nonstop, and the Fair Housing team has grown too in those 4 years. It was, I think, 2 people to start out with, and now we have a team of about 11 people. So we're putting a lot of investment into our fair housing work, and it's been a really important time to be at HCD. If you care about these issues, as Gustavo laid out, Director Velasquez laid out, that we have a real commitment there, and we are really striving to make sure that we meet the mandate and support local jurisdictions in meeting the mandate. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about AFFH law. And Gustavo touched on this a bit, but I'm going to drill down a little bit and talk about HCD's access to opportunity work. First, I do want to thank the Federation and the Alliance for having HCD here. The purpose of this presentation is to help you understand recent developments in AFFH and HCD's vision for affirmatively furthering fair housing. While the work of the department has always been deeply connected to fair housing issues, our efforts have become much more intentionally focused on addressing racial equity and broadening access to opportunity within the last few years, in part to the passage of recent legislation, which we're going to discuss today. First, I'm going to discuss a little bit about AFFH and then discuss what's next for HCD's AFFH access to opportunity work. So first, what is affirmatively furthering fair housing? As Gustavo laid out, we have, we now have AB 686, which is now the law of the land. It was enacted in 2019, and the intent was to codify that strong 2015 Obama rule on AFFH and state law. AFFH has had a very challenging history of implementation since the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and the Obama rule is well understood as one of the strongest efforts to meet really the spirit of that law and the mandate of that law. And so what we did in the state is we pulled the definition directly from the Obama rule. And so in AB 686, affirmatively furthering fair housing is defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. And the law goes on further to say the duty to affirmatively further fair housing extends to all public agencies, activities, and programs relating to housing and community development. The law goes on to give us some clarity on what is meant by meaningful actions. So meaningful actions must aim to accomplish the following: address significant disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and of course, foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. I know it's been covered well here today, but I'll just add, there's an explicit need for policies at AFFH. That is because despite half a century mandate and obligation to prohibit housing discrimination, forces driving residential segregation still persist today. In fact, the racially explicit practices were often replaced by more subtle methods to exclude people of color from predominantly white, higher resource neighborhoods, often through planning and zoning laws. Exclusionary zoning policies combined with the practice of disproportionately placing affordable housing in low resource neighborhoods and not high resource communities continues to reinforce the spatial segregation of low income communities and communities of color here in California. Housing policy, program guidelines, and regulations were essential in creating current inequities, and they are also equally important in both preventing further segregation and concentration of poverty, as well as increasing widespread access to opportunity for all. As Stella mentioned, that part of our job is unraveling our history of exclusion and segregation, and that's really what we see our mandate as through AFFH at HCD. So let's go back to the law a little bit, AB 686. We've discussed the definition in the newish law, but now let's talk a little bit about that public agencies piece that was mentioned earlier. AB 686 requires all California public agencies to affirmatively further fair housing. It establishes an independent mandate for all California public agencies to adhere to AFFH regardless of future federal actions, really trying to lock in place that Obama rule that AB 686 is trying to make sure that is codified in state law. This mandates that state and local public agencies facilitate deliberate action to explicitly address and combat disparities resulting from patterns of segregation to foster inclusive communities. And all public agencies must administer programs and activities related to housing and community development, broadly defined in a manner that AFFHs, and take no action inconsistent with that obligation. The law also creates new requirements for housing elements due to be revised after January 1st, 2021. First, let's talk about that public agencies piece. We understand public agency to be construed broadly and includes most governmental agencies in California. The housing agencies are more straightforward. That's going to be us, HCD. That's going to be the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, CDLAC, the Strategic Growth Council, which also has housing programs. So HCD is in the process of thinking through how to advance our equity programs, our scoring, so that we advance access to opportunity, and how to make sure our funding programs are serving all Californians. We are also thinking about barriers for developers of color in accessing our programs as well. On the community development side of that public agencies mandate, we also interpret that to be very broad. So any public agency that administers programs and activities relating to education, water, transportation, the environment are all subject to this new requirement, because all of those things are part and parcel of community development. Many factors play into community development, and many agencies play a role. They're also going to make sure that they are executing their programs and activities in a way that AFFH is. The bill also establishes new housing element requirements that Gustavo talked a bit about, and that applies to housing elements that are due to be revised after January 1st, 2021. So now all housing elements must include an assessment of fair housing and AFH, complete with analysis, priorities, and programs with timelines and metrics for implementation aimed at ameliorating fair housing issues over the housing element cycle. Also in the housing element, the site inventory must affirmatively further fair housing. The purpose of the housing element site inventory is to identify and analyze specific land that is available and suitable to accommodate the regional housing need by income group. AB 686 requires that jurisdictions assess the extent to which the site inventory further entrenches or ameliorates existing patterns of segregation or the exclusion of protected class members. It should be informed and responsive to the findings in the AFFH analysis. As Gustavo mentioned, we know that this is a new requirement for jurisdictions, so we have worked hard to develop a strong guidance document that you can find on our website, and that lays out what our thinking is around this new requirement. That went up during Fair Housing Month last year. We also, as Gustavo mentioned, have a data tool that we have created as well, Because we know it's a new mandate and that it's challenging sometimes to get for local governments, especially smaller local governments, to get their hands on the types of data that they'll need to do the analysis. So we wanted to provide that up front. That's on our website as well. And not only is that for local governments who are trying to implement this, but it's also it democratizes the information. If a local government looks at does the analysis and toggles a couple of the different metrics in the opportunity maps and comes out with one evaluation of opportunity or of fair housing in the jurisdiction, our hope is that local advocates and others can ground truth that and also look at that data tool and determine whether or not the housing element has the right read on the fair housing issues. So what's next? I want to discuss a little bit about where we see this going, AFFH and access to opportunity. We're doing our housing element implementation. We have annually worked on the opportunity maps, which are a tool for funding programs to make sure that we can target affordable housing resources into high resource areas. But we want to be thoughtful and intentional about our work going forward. And so in recent years, it's come up for us that the interest in policies to advance AFFH and access to opportunity have grown really significantly, and really in three primary categories that stick out to us. First, the legislature has been advancing proposals to include opportunity policy frameworks and land use decision-making for the last few years. Beyond AB 686, this hasn't really manifested in new laws yet, but we anticipate that this discussion will continue as the legislature moves forward. Production-focused bills seeking to be inclusive of equity issues, and we want to be able to be responsive to that. The passage of new laws that mandate the inclusion of AFFH that Director Velasquez laid out earlier, but that's in the housing element, also in the regional housing needs allocation process or RHNA process. That's a new mandate. So that's a new sort of exploration for us around AFFH. RHNA methodologies now must include AFFH as a required statutory objective they need to achieve. And then finally, we're seeing increased inclusion of AFFH scoring metrics in affordable housing programs. So when we step back and considered this increased interest, it became clear to us that we need to develop a broader framework that is inclusive of all the constituent parts of that definition of AFFH that we looked at earlier. While we've always understood that AFFH is much more than mobility strategies, we acknowledge that the TCAC HC opportunity maps, our best developed tool to AFFH, was primarily a tool to identify high resource areas that could enhance the life outcomes of low-income families with children through investment in affordable housing. Mobility strategies are not the only pathway to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and we know we need to build out the research basis and strategies and tools to AFFH through community development, lifting up struggling communities and building out important resources in those places. This has to be part and parcel of a state strategy to AFFH. We also need to make sure that we have strategies to avoid displacement in communities going through gentrification. So to that end, we're going to begin a process this year to bring more stakeholders to the table to help us build out research-supported strategies to AFFH and all of the constituent parts of that AFFH definition and all the arenas that we're called upon to engage. The goal of HCE's expanded AFFH work is to expand our knowledge, our tools and resources to advance AFFH policies, address community development, place-based initiatives, the impact of community development corporations, strategies to offset segregation and other AFFH issues like displacement. And we also want to make sure that we're engaging stakeholders to inform our strategic approach. We know that there is a ton of history and hard work by many in our state to advance our affirmatively furthering fair housing agenda. And so we want to have the benefit of those stakeholders. And so we're going to be reaching out to those folks this year too. And we started planning for this, and we're going to be kicking off this effort this year. So that's what we're thinking as next steps. That's a little bit about our work so far. Thank you for the time, and that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Tyrone, thank you so much for that. It's as always, you speak with clarity and authority and spirit, and I appreciate all of that. This is why we are here today. At this time, I'd like to welcome Ricardo Flores, ask him to join us for a community dialogue. We've got some questions here we're going to ask. I'm going to ask folks to put questions in the chat between myself and other staff here. We're monitoring those questions. We'll share them. So I've got a few questions to kick us off. And Director Velasquez, you're here as well. Please, if you can rejoin us. My first question is you. Ricardo, hello.
Hello. Okay,
and there's Gustavo, there's Tyron. So the gang of us are here. So let me start off with the first question here for Gustavo. Let me, if I may, Gustavo, how does the statewide housing plan address the huge need for evidence-based data to help lawmakers make well-grounded decisions on housing policy?
Thank you for that question, Stephen. Great to see Ricardo. Thank you, Tyron, for the deeper dive there. Along with the statewide housing action plan that basically lays out the major goals and the progress that so far we're making to achieve that goal of 2.5 million new homes between now and 2030. With that action plan, there is a 10-year data strategy that is included that goes at exactly at your question, right? In order for us to track that we are year after year getting to that goal of 2.5. And again, like I noted in my remarks, not just the scale of, the volume of the new housing that has to be created, but how, and this ties exactly to this conversation of furthering fair housing. We need to have a way to collect the right data and report the right data, democratizing data. We've already made efforts, but the 10-year data strategy really lays out additional pieces of information that we will be collecting and reporting on a continuous basis to track that progress. The AFFH data tool on our website is fulfilling some of that purpose. If you haven't seen it, we welcome everybody to see it, but we know we need a lot more data to collect and track. And that's what the 10-year data strategy is all about.
And I did put the data tools, the link to that page with all the data tools in the chat, so folks can keep paying attention to us, but you can also play on your computer and look at some of those maps. To follow up, Gustavo, if I may ask, in your remarks, you mentioned increasing building housing production in high opportunity areas as one solution for climate change in relation to affordable housing equity. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Right. So we always hear that that the creation of more housing in areas that, I have to say, first of all, I'm a little conflicted sometimes about talking about high opportunity, non-high opportunity areas. I mean, I think we all acknowledge that all communities have assets that we need to acknowledge and celebrate, right? So it's a little, this body of work where we started really talking about the opportunity mapping, it goes back to about 25 years ago when researchers at, national think tanks started thinking more about mapping out communities by levels of opportunity. But it's still, even though it makes sense, it's still, I think, I hope to you as well, it just, I don't know, it's a little conflicting to think about that. So we've always heard that just for sake of conversation, that these higher opportunity areas where we want to incentivize more creation of housing overlap with also our goals of furthering our climate goals. Under the assumption that these areas have, comparatively speaking, greater proximity to the amenities that we enjoy on a daily basis. And that reduce, knowing that more than 40% of our harmful greenhouse gas emissions come from cars and trucks, that the less use of vehicle, the reduction of vehicle miles traveled are going to have a positive net effect on climate. And so we've always known that there is some overlap. So the effort that we're taking on right now is going through some, mapping exercises to kind of determine really what are some of these areas where we can get the most out of the climate impacts. The governor has been lately talking more and more about the powerful effect of where we create more housing opportunities that can also advance our climate goals. So we're examining this more and more from a perspective of vehicle miles reduction, proximity to jobs, schools, other types of places where people, often go to. And we know we're beginning to see a strong correlation. I wouldn't say is definitive, but we do see a strong correlation. So that's a very positive thing to see, because it basically moves us in a direction where we are basically achieving two major goals as part of our increasing efforts to create more housing and also achieve other types of objectives. But it's never going to be 100%, and this is certainly important in the context of creating more housing in rural communities. We have to know that our state is so diverse that there is no one approach to how we go about creating more housing. So that's what I have.
Well, so, and I'm going to ask Ricardo in a second here to maybe comment on that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that dynamic tension between making investments in high opportunity areas versus communities where the only community investment going on is the housing program that we're doing. And these are often TOD type areas. So there is that dynamic tension we need to resolve. And Ricardo, I saw you nodding in a way that I feel like you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me here, and Director Velasquez and Deputy Director, Assistant Director Buckley, thank you for being here. And you, Stephen, thank you for putting this on. So yeah, no, I think that that's a very good point. One of the things that we're trying to think about with these high opportunity areas, and I think Director Velasquez is absolutely right when he says all communities have some value, some strong value, especially in communities that we work in, where oftentimes the value of those communities, the culture that they're bringing from abroad, and the ability to market that culture for the pleasure and enjoyment and entertainment of all of us. But here, one of the things we're doing here in San Diego is that we are looking at trying to build housing in high opportunity areas. And the reason why we're interested in that, in middle class housing for $500,000, the reason why is because, unfortunately, in the world that we live in right now, not all land appreciates equally. And so we have a grant program, the San Diego Black Homebuyer Program, where we're providing $49,000 in grant dollars, no liens, no recapture. But we have an issue with pipeline. We're putting folks in condos, and these are small families, and we need to service larger families because there's a need for them as well, and not everybody can live in a condo. And so if we're going to build housing, we want to make sure we build housing that appreciates for these families, and that's really important because that's a real big challenge that we can't quite. Your land appreciates a certain amount, and if you live maybe less than a mile away in another neighborhood, it has a higher appreciation value. And so how do we compensate for those things? But I also think too, the other thing is, to folks that are listening, I mean, this is the fulfillment of the civil rights laws. We have never fulfilled those laws. We've gone far, but we need to go further. And in this particular instance, we need to have communities that are balanced. And I'm always struck because I have a background, as Stephen mentioned, in politics. And so I've done a lot of door-to-door in my life, and so have a lot of colleagues, and so do our local folks. And the uncanny thing is that all of us can say the same thing. There are neighborhoods that are completely homogenous, where we're knocking on doors and we're saying, "Hi, we'd like you to support this," and yet the same looking family comes out every single time. And then at one point, It doesn't fit type. And this goes both ways. This goes for inner city neighborhoods and this goes for kind of our suburban, whiter, wealthier neighborhoods. And so as long as that pattern continues, we are going to have challenges as a country. And it's very simple, right? It's simple in the sense that we have to have a generation of children that grow up in a diverse neighborhood and have a diverse experience. And that doesn't just mean black, brown, and white kids, but it also means working class kids, college educated families, etc. It's really important. And actually what's really fascinating here is for our two colleagues here in Sacramento, we have that in San Diego. We had two communities in San Diego. One of them is called Linda Vista, and the other one was called Frontier Housing, which we're all talking about now with Sports Arena. These were integrated communities created by the federal government because of the response and the need for World War II. And I'll take it a quick step further. My father actually grew up in Frontier Housing and later lived in Linda Vista. And he will tell me, and I actually have a member of my board who also grew up in Frontier Housing, and both of them will say anecdotally that they feel that their experience growing up in a community that was diverse, black, white, brown, a little bit of everything, really helped them in their careers in order to be able to work with others. And so I think it's a really important thing that we start to think about that. And I'm just so grateful that our two state colleagues here are really pushing that and interested in that, and groups like Lisk and others here in San Diego are very much interested in this conversation as well.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I'm continuing. We are getting questions from the audience. I've got a few more questions here I want to share, and we will go back and forth a little bit in a moment here. But if I could ask maybe both Gustavo and Tyrone a question here about, we're 4 years into the passing of AB 686 as a framework for AFFH in California. What would you say are some impactful ways that you've seen local governments use AB 686 that can be replicated in San Diego and across the state? Gustavo, can you lead off?
Yeah, I'll start and then have Tyrone weigh in as well. There's a lot that I would say this. There is a lot that we still have not seen in terms of the effects of AB 686 versus what we have seen. Let me just put it that way. It's a lot of great information that we use to create the guidelines that kind of expand. Really, it's our guidelines is just additional information that basically prepares local jurisdictions to implement effectively AB 686. And I would say there's great stuff happening on the planning side, but I think I'll just put it this way. I think it just remains to be seen whether the implementation of AB 686 will be as effective as we believe it intended to be. And it's not a great answer, Steve. It's not a great answer, but it's the answer I have. I think we're doing every effort to hold jurisdictions to the ground on ensuring that our guidelines are looked at and considered whenever they're submitting their housing elements. And we hope the execution will be just as good as we're seeing the efforts of planning. But execution is a different animal. So that's why it's important to keep tracking. Going back to your first question on data, how jurisdictions are making progress. So, Tyrone.
Thank you. I think that's reflective of the experience I've seen too. I would add that one of the things that we're really heartened to see when we get in housing elements is a strong analysis that looks at all the component pieces of AFFH, right? So it's not just looking at mobility strategies and how to create access to opportunity, but also thinking about community development strategies. So if you have a site inventory that has a significant portion of your low-income RENA going to what might be characterized as low resource communities, include a program in there about how you're going to help lift up resources in that community, right? So that we can see that in your programs and your actions going forward. That's really key. That's something that's really helpful for our reviewers as housing elements come in. And then on that programs piece, really making sure that your programs are responsive to what you found in your assessment of fair housing, right? Oftentimes, too often, I'd say we get a set of programs that don't even address some of the fair housing issues that were found in the analysis, and making sure that there is a tight connection between those things, between those actions and what was found through the strong fair housing analysis is really important. And make sure they're measurable, right? We are going to be looking at our annual reports over the life of the housing element, and we're going to want to make sure that you're meeting some metrics and milestones for incorporating some of those programs and activities. So those are two things that are really helpful for us as we're trying to support jurisdictions in meeting the mandate. And then the last thing I'd say is, give yourself time to, it's really helpful when jurisdictions give themselves time to engage in the TA and the instruction we can provide around housing elements. Oftentimes, jurisdictions might back themselves into a corner by submitting very late, and then the interplay between us where we can be supportive and help folks think through how to solve challenges around fair housing just isn't available. So those are really the 3 points that stick out in my head.
Great, thank you, thank you. And I guess we can continue to both of you guys here, to Gustavo and Tyrone. What kind of guidance are you giving on implementing SB 9? And do you think that is going to, if you could briefly explain SB 9 and then talk about whether you think it will stimulate more fair housing in California.
Tyron, you want to go first?
SB 9 hasn't been sort of the focus of my work so far, but I do think that as we're looking at jurisdictions implementing SB 9, we're going to be thinking about any potential impact it might have on existing low-income communities, right? So as we see that investment go in, and we see, hopefully see the development of more housing that takes advantage and starts to break up some of those single-family zone jurisdictions, that the communities that live there now still have an opportunity to benefit from that increase in resources and aren't displaced. So that's what I think we're going to be looking at as we especially see programs and housing elements that are working to implement SB 9 to make sure that jurisdictions are thoughtful about those kinds of AFFH impacts.
Just a point, you would just add something, just a point of clarification. As the SB 9 legislation did not give HCD direct authority or oversight responsibilities. However, we very recently, if you go to our website, we published a fact sheet. This was something that we were asked by the legislature, because a lot of, as soon as SB 9 was signed into law, of course, there was a flurry of local jurisdictions reaching out to state legislatures to clarify a bunch of things. So we were asked to sort of lay out some basic facts of SB 9, what it does mostly. But I would say that very quickly, we started seeing some efforts by some local jurisdictions who clearly do not agree with SB 9 to begin meddling with other state mandates that very much, can easily cross the line with SB 9. ADU law is one clear example. Other authorities that we actually have oversight over. So in addition to that, we're working on a kind of an FAQ to inform localities what not to do if they are attempting to circumvent this SB 9 requirement, what not to do that can really have a spillover effect into violations of SB 330, ADU law, other things where we actually have jurisdiction over. So that should come out very soon. And it mostly will go, I don't know if that will be made public, but it will go to every local jurisdiction so that they understand that SB 9, any efforts to try to prevent SB 9 implementation in their localities can actually violate other statutes.
Well, and Ricardo, let me turn the question to you in a different frame, which is, one of the ways we've seen ADUs as potential wealth building for communities that have not been able to realize the value of their assets. Can you talk a little bit about the positive side, promoting this as wealth generation?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think subdivision is really the key here. If you, what I use as an analogy is, if Director Velasquez and I were going into a store to buy one orange, and the store owner said, I don't like nonprofits, so Ricardo, you have to buy 5 cartons of oranges. And Director Velasquez, I like the state of California, here's your one orange. That's what we're doing in certain communities. If you want to live in a certain community, you need to buy 5 cartons of oranges or rent 5 cartons of oranges, and in others, you don't have to. And so the question becomes, how do you make land cheaper without destroying land values, right? Because destroying land values is counterintuitive to everybody. So the only way to make it cheaper is to allow you to buy less of it. And so we have communities where, again, to live in it, you have to pay 5,000 or 7,000 square feet. Well, we could allow 1/4 of that, and that would drop the price of land 1/4. And then you add the construction costs. So you could build a home in Point Loma, Kensington, and a lot of these neighborhoods for $500,000, where currently one sits for $1 million. That's the kind of stuff we have to start to think about. And subdivision is very powerful because it gets to that point. And remember, that was the way we got into this mess, was by saying, if you want to live here, you need to buy more. And it worked. It wildly worked because, again, neighborhoods are very homogeneous. And this isn't just in San Diego or the state of California. This is all over the country. I tell folks all the time, tell me a neighborhood where you're from. Tell me what the neighborhood looks like, and I'll tell you who lives there. I'll tell you the race of the people that live in that neighborhood. And usually I'm pretty right. How is that possible? How is that humanly possible that I can do that? Well, it's because we've created these patterns, and we really haven't disrupted these patterns. And to your last question, what the Director Velasquez and Mr. Buckley were answering, in terms of, well, what can jurisdictions do? Well, I think that's really where we all come in, right? The city of San Diego, groups like Lisk and others, we come in and we say, this is what we think should be going on in our jurisdictions. What do you guys at the state think? Does this work? Will this have that effect? And so I think that in some ways, we're all in a new territory here, but we all have the same desire and the goal, which is to create a more equitable community and a community that flourishes because it's in all of our interest.
Well, so let me follow to Gustavo and to Ricardo. And let's start with Gustavo here. There's always, this follows, I think, logically, there's always a tug and a pull between what the state says is needed on things and what local communities want more of or less than. Can you tell us where you see that delta, and how can we get closer in sync to really move things along in the area of fair housing locally and statewide? And how can San Diego prime ourselves in this partnership?
There's always this tense relationship, right, in kind of a state, localities, and control. And what we always tell localities is, let's just, we're respectful of local control. This happens a lot when it comes to changes in zoning patterns or land use, policies. We're just trying to approach this as a partner where, we do have a state mandates that cannot be circumvented. State law, trumps many of these localities. If something has become quite evident in this front is, for example, in the implementation of our home key program, where there's a lot that state law allow the state to do in order to, when necessary, waive kind of local approvals. And there's been all of this, tension between the fact that localities have said, well, we should have control over where housing is created. These are local matters, local decisions. And for the most part, we do wholeheartedly agree with that divide and our kind of our federalist approach within its the state the state constitutional framework. But I do think that state mandates are very important for what we're trying to accomplish. We're all together in alleviating the crisis of housing affordability and the crisis of homelessness. And the tense back and forth is going to be there. But we just want to make sure people understand how drastic the crises are and how every locality has to comply with the state law. And short of that, we are respectful of local control, and we do believe that localities should establish parameters in which they decide where housing goes.
So Ricardo, your take on the struggle between state and local, the dynamic tension there.
Yeah, no, I think what folks tend to forget about local government is their main role is land use. That's what they do. And so the idea that they can't come together, a city like San Diego, $1 billion budget, and start to make decisions that would allow and accommodate for growth, but also allow for an increase of their tax base, right? Because if you think about Prop 13, in the neighborhood I live in, Kensington, there are people in my neighborhood that pay about $1,000 in property taxes, and some of them even less because their home is historical. It's a 1920 tract home and it's historical. And so they're paying less property taxes. That's the problem, right? And so if you allow, again, for the land to be utilized differently, to subdivide it, you're allowing for that property tax base to be retriggered. All that goes back into cities and state, and so, and allows for the growth. And so cities have every interest in doing these changes. The challenge becomes, and this is something Director Gustavo and his colleague, Assistant Director Buckley, can't do, which is they can't take the political arrows for you, right? Our elected leaders in the world that we're in now, they have to lead on this issue. But the good thing about it is that the cities will benefit, their communities will benefit, and even the communities that say, we don't want change, we want to leave our neighborhood the way it is, these people will benefit, because the land's value is only predicated upon what you can do with it. And so there are folks in communities like Point Loma and Kensington that they can only do one thing with their land. They can put a home smack dab in the middle of it with a front yard and a backyard. If you allow them to do more with their land, the value will increase. So there's really no losers here. The losers are this: if you grew up in a neighborhood and you're just not comfortable living next to people of color, or you grew up in a neighborhood and you're just not comfortable living next to people that are working class, that's the challenge for you and your family. It's an internal challenge, but it should not be legislated by the government. So the other thing I'll add too is we, in the housing element that the city of San Diego shared with the state, they actually, in their appendix, they actually provided a history of segregation in the city of San Diego from the time of the Spaniards to now. And it very clearly says, and in 1923, there was a discussion had in which they wanted to implement zoning, but they did not want that zoning to interfere with the covenants that were already in place. So it was very clear what the city council was trying to do. Again, these are discussions we have to have here. How did that happen? Why did that happen? What was the effect of that happening? And what can we do about it? These are not conversations that folks in Sacramento can have with us. What I'm grateful for, folks in Sacramento, is that they've put a guidepost and that they've said, we are going to keep an eye on this guidepost. And they have. And they're working with groups like Lisk and others who say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't seem to make sense. Does this make sense to you all? That's really important. But again, when I look at our local government leaders at this point, I can only say that all of them look at segregation, inequality as moral issues. And if they are moral issues, then they have to be addressed, because that's a very strong statement to make.
Super. Thank you, Ricardo. So I want to acknowledge that Gustavo has a 10:30 hard stop. We can continue a little bit past that, but I want to take a couple audience questions here while you're still here, Gustavo. So these are wild cards. I guess one question from Nancy Restrepo Wilson from Father Joe's Villages, asking about the timeline for assessing how your work is progressing. Do you have statutory reporting deadlines or monitoring deadlines to know that you're on track or that we're off track?
Yeah, well, the one very important deadline that we keep an eye on is the annual progress reports the local jurisdictions provide to the state housing department. And it's a whole host of data points that we ask of local jurisdictions, require of local jurisdictions. And these annual reports then get summarized as a statewide and then reported. But we, of course, have the data jurisdiction by jurisdiction. One of the reasons why I like to use the progress on annual progress reports is it gives us a sense of how much housing is being created that is deeply affordable. The type of housing for folks earning, very low incomes. We use the area median income as a barometer. 30% or less of the area median income, very low income. Working families, even 50% or less of area median income in the city of San Diego is someone earning, just really a low wage worker. And that is where the largest gap in supply of housing is, because it requires a much stronger level of all the types of subsidies in order to create that kind of really expensive housing. Some of this housing has to be accompanied with supported services for the families that live there, and so it's very expensive to produce the housing. It's where the biggest shortage is. And so the annual progress reports gives us a very concrete time by time account on how far behind we are. Let me put it that way: how far behind we are in creating the affordable that is for the working poor. And so, but that's just one data point that we concretely track. Our website, again, in the data dashboard, has other really good stuff that comes out of the annual progress reports collectively across the state.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to open this to whoever would like to answer, but there's a question from Rachel D. is whether there are systems in place to monitor the ethics of property management companies, specifically when it comes to raising rents or establishing high income requirements for rental approval. And can you speak to which systems that might be in place?
Anyone else wants to?
Rent registry is something that I think some jurisdictions look at just to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in their communities. One of the things that Gustavo and his team has been doing really well is the California Rent Relief Program. And if we had these rent registries all over the state, we would probably be able to communicate easier with folks that are out there and to find that. And again, this is just data. We're just trying to collect data, right, to understand what's happening in our market. But there's a lot of pushback on rent registries, interestingly enough, because some folks don't want that data. But again, that would be very important to find out, and very important for policymakers to better understand the needs and the concerns of the community.
And then let me ask another one here. That's what is the state doing to break barriers for individuals who have a felony background?
Well, let me say, interestingly enough, I think HUD just announced, when I was in the Obama administration, you remember, this is very much related to fair housing, the promulgation of a disparate impact rule. So just to describe generally what that is policies, practices that either governments or private entities put in place that disproportionately affect people that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So the disparate impact rule, basically what it did is we gave a framework for the legal community to litigate cases where these policies have to go up against a judge or a jury to prove that a policy has a disproportionately impact on these communities by race or ethnicity, and obviously that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So following the enactment of that rule, what we did is we started putting out guidance for housing providers, local state governments, on the applicability of this rule in the context of certain communities. One clear example of it was policies that had the ban either in ordinances. I remember coming to, I don't know if you know where the town of Hesperia is. It's that was one of the ordinances that we were looking at when we were at HUD. There was just a ban on people with arrest and convictions records to to access housing. And so what we did is we enacted this guidance in order to clarify that these policies were in violation, could potentially be litigated in violation of the Fair Housing Act. All of that was again reversed in the Trump administration. Just heard that HUD is back at it and trying to resuscitate, those guides for housing providers to understand how serious it is for them, to shut out people who, had a conviction 20 years ago, or had a, I understand, certain convictions or records recent and for major offenses, but, possession, misdemeanor, possession of, small quantities of, marijuana that just arrest records for things like that would just completely shut out people from the opportunity to rent an apartment. So these are things that the state of California, the work of another department, a sister department, Department of Fair and Employment. What is it? The Fair and Employment.
DFH.
Department of Fair and
Employment and Fair Housing. Yes.
It's DFH. I hate to say it. Fair Employment and Housing. Fair Employment. Kevin Kish might call it. Well, they are looking at this. I actually just spoke with the director there yesterday. It is important for the state of California to begin looking at this systemically, and I hope we will advance this important guidelines that are coming out of HUD and replicate those, just like we did with AB 686 in the context of policies that harm communities of color just because of who they are.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna continue here for a few minutes, but I want to acknowledge, Gustavo, you need to go. Are there any last words you want to leave us with before you go to your next?
Just, happy Fair Housing Month again. Thank you to all the groups that are participating. Lisk, you did a terrific job in terms of, pushing, keep advocating, just keep doing that. It helps tremendously. Your advice, your great sounding board to you and all of the other groups that are participating today, keep the accountability high. That's very important. And thank you again for inviting.
Great. Gustavo, thank you so much for being with us today. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you for the work you're doing. We're going to continue here for a few more minutes. We have a couple more questions and I'm going to throw them out there. You can loosen up now. The big guy's gone, so we can chill out a little bit. So Gustavo was wonderful, so I shouldn't joke here, but I should. I have questions that I'm going to start throwing this toward Tyrone here. Is how do private developers who build communities diversify their applicant pool to include BIPOC individuals without violating fair housing standards? Are there ways of expanding the pool of applicants and successful applicants for apartments and for home purchases? Again,
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't hazard to give anyone legal advice, but I would say that I think that affirmative marketing is something that's been sort of a tried and true approach to making sure that you reach populations that don't usually apply for your programs. I think from a fair housing perspective, generally what we find is if folks do an evaluation of the folks who have been able to take advantage of that opportunity in housing, especially in high resource areas, while there is some diversification that happens in affordable housing in high resource areas, it often goes in majority white areas to majority white people. And so I think that if a housing provider that wants to sort of justify reaching out to a broader set of the community, I think they can probably just do an analysis of who they're reaching now. And that generally justifies being able to say, whoa, we need to do some affirmative marketing because we're underrepresented for different protected classes. So that's been my experience.
Well, let me follow up on that really specifically from Dolores here. Would the state ever consider requiring all projects with state or other funding to have an affordable fair housing marketing plan? It's currently required by HUD for multifamily, but can the state do something along the same lines?
I'm not sure. I think I think one of the things that folks, we have a lot of agency, and we've actually been given much more agency at HCD, and really being a leader in housing policy in the last few years. But one of the things I've learned, as Stephen mentioned, I was previously a policy director at Housing California, and one of the things I've learned as I've come on is that to state service is that we are often implementing the mandates of the legislature, of the governor's office, and I think that those types of policies that advance something like that, that would match up, are things that usually come from the legislature and we end up implementing. We obviously are a voice in that discussion, and we try to lift up ideas that we think are helpful to achieving the mission. And I think that idea is one that's reflective there. But that's something I think that would move through the legislature and not through state government. And that's a distinction that I don't think I fully understood until I came on to the state.
Ricardo, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, for folks in San Diego, we want to do that. That's what we want to do here in San Diego, and you're in this community. Like I mentioned, we have a Black homebuyer grant program, $49,000 to families that are eligible, or families that are living and buying Black families in San Diego County, and we've done 19. And so again, we have an issue with pipeline. And so our goal is to partner with Habitat for Humanity and build housing in neighborhoods, any neighborhood really, but ideally in neighborhoods where the land appreciates greater, better schools, all of that stuff for our families if they so desire, and provide that to them. The big barrier we have is zoning. We cannot build on a 5,000 or 7,000 square feet parcel of land. It's too expensive. We need to make it smaller. And so, I think, again, the idea here is there are good ideas out there, and especially, I think, coming from San Diego, just kind of knowing some of my YIMBY colleagues in the Bay Area, and we can provide that to homeowners. But the interesting thing is, if we do the same thing for our program for Black home buyers, we're actually opening up for anybody, for middle class families as well, because the need and the desire is so great. So I would just say to folks that if that's of interest to you, let me know, because we want to ask our city council, let us build these things. Let us build this product. Let us build a $500,000 home for these families. And what's important is these are fee simple homes. These are not homes adjoined to joining walls and whatnot, because condos can be challenging.
And I will just point out that our 11 o'clock session is going to be on fair housing and home ownership, with a panel just on that topic. And so we'll even hear more about that. We are rapidly approaching the end of our session here. And I just want to ask, first I'll ask, Tyrone, if you had any last words you wanted to, you've got 150 or so local advocates here, people eager to take up arms, well, metaphorical arms, to take up the cause, the banner. Is there support that you would need from our region, things we can do as a region that would make the vision for your job even easier to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that, so my unit implements RENA. So we issue determinations and review methodologies. Also, within the housing policy division, where my unit is housed, we're reviewing housing elements. And I can't reinforce enough how important it is to get those letters from the community about what's actually happening in the community. The evaluation locally around RENA, around housing elements, really informs our work. As much as we try, but especially during COVID, we're not getting down to jurisdictions as much as we did before. And and we're also we've hired a ton of people, as I mentioned before. A lot of those folks are new to review of RENA and housing elements. And so when we get a letter from a jurisdiction and from advocates in a jurisdiction or a constituent in a jurisdiction that can give us greater insights into what we're seeing in that housing element, what the shortcomings may be, what they got right, even, all those things are really valuable to us, and are often the things that initiate further discussion with jurisdictions. As we have been looking at housing elements, I don't think there's been a housing element yet that hasn't come back to the jurisdiction with findings about what they need to do better. And some of that is based on things we learned from letters, right? That got highlighted from letters, where we learned, oh, well, there really wasn't a lot of community engagement here, and they had one meeting, and that just wasn't enough, and they didn't reach all economic segments of the population. That gives us an opportunity to start that conversation with the jurisdiction. Or their site inventory is way out of balance, and there's no justification for having all of that low income RENA in this particular place. Those are things that can help inform the discussion, and then also bring out better programs and analysis from the jurisdiction. So I would just encourage folks to get really engaged. I know it's tiresome. I know not everyone in this meeting today earns their living through affordable housing advocacy, and just do it as an interest. I know it's hard, but I would just buoy your spirit by saying that we read them and we pay attention to it, and it's really helpful to our work.
Great. Ricardo, in 2 minutes, what would you ask with this captive audience of housing advocates here?
Well, first off, I want to echo what Deputy Director Buckley said. We have engaged with that department, and they've engaged back with us. They call us, they ask us questions. So I would definitely urge folks to do that, because it doesn't just go into wherever. It actually goes, and people read it and they'll respond. I would just say to folks on this call, if you're from San Diego, join us in what we're trying to do, because we're trying to unlock the value of 53% of the city that has not been built on for over 100 years. Think about that. 53% of the city not been built on for over 100 years, if we go back to the redlining maps. Help us do that, because not only are we going to increase the potential local economy, but we're going to help families that are living in poverty, and also help families that are maybe attending schools that aren't as strong as they should be. This is really the cause of our country at the end of the day. If we can't get this right, if we can't create a society that our Bill of Rights says we all need to aspire to, then what is the promise of this great country, right? Because it can't just be wealth. Wealth is nothing without having good moral values and other things, and bringing people with you. This is the cause of our times. And the other thing is, for the folks out there that are saying, you know what, I'm nervous, I'm scared of what you're going to do in my neighborhood. Nothing is going to happen to your neighborhood, because all this happens very slowly. And so, again, urge you to join us, reach out to us on our website. But yeah, please join us in this great endeavor.
Great, thank you. I want to read one comment, because I think we've gotten everybody else's voices heard. Angela Rowe just thanked everybody here for this today, and her comment is that there needs to be an emphasis on the needs for families involved in child welfare services as a way of reducing foster care. And she loves the concept that housing is a right, especially for families. And so, Angela, I want to make sure you know you're heard here today. With that, I want to thank our two guests here, Ricardo Flores, who is the Executive Director of Lisk San Diego. Ricardo, thank you. I'm proud to call you a friend.
Yes.
Both. Thank you for being here and adding some of your fervor. Tyrone, as always, I'm sorry, I should say Assistant Deputy Director Buckley. Tyrone, it's great that you are here. Thank you for the work that you do, for that call for people to be engaged. This is why we are doing this conference today, so we are informed, we are engaged, and we can change the future. We cannot change the past, but we can definitely change the future. Thank you for the work that you do there. With that, I'm going to thank everyone for being here today. We're going to take a little bit of a break. Please be sure to come back at 11 for our session on fair housing and home ownership. Please, if you're going to be in that next session, you can do your survey after that. If you're leaving after this session, there's a link to a survey that's in the chat. Please be sure to do that. I also want to, what else do I want to do? Thank once again, so do our survey, yes. If you want to be engaged, sign up for the San Diego Housing Federation Weekly Brief. We will alert you to opportunities to comment on some of these policies and programs. Most of you probably already get those weekly briefs. If not, go to housingsandiego.org, and there's a place where you can sign up for a weekly brief. I'm going to thank our sponsors one more time, the San Diego Housing Commission, Citibank, and California Housing Finance Agency for sponsoring today. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll see you all back here at 11 a.m.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.